Hi everyone again. Thank you for joining us here today for the Culture and the Smart City Provocation series, and a very warm welcome to you, whether you are joining us through Zoom or Facebook. As an introduction, I am Shufan, and I'm the advisor and curator of the Culture and the Smart City project. I am also an assistant professor at the Singapore Management University, where I am also the lead coordinator of the Arts and Culture Management program. Amongst the several hats that I wear, I am also senior research advisor to the Global Cultural Districts Network, which is an international membership association that brings together cultural associations and leaders interested in the intersection of culture and urban life. I'm delighted to welcome each and every one of you here to today's dialogue, whether you are based in Singapore or elsewhere. But before we start the dialogue proper, I would like to just share some contextual background of the project, so do bear with me for a few minutes. So the Culture and the Smart City project is a multilateral collaboration initiated by the European Union National Institutes for Culture, UNIC for short, members in Singapore under the guidance of the Goethe-Institut Singapore. This project was first actually conceptualized more than 2 years ago. It was initially conceptualized with my initial collaborators, Han Song and Aurel, as well as myself, because we wanted to bring about a new focus on the arts, culture, creativity, and communities within the discourse of the smart city. This is because when many typically think about the smart city, we usually think about its infrastructure, its technology, and its governance. However, the focus is not always on urban cultural transformation, and also not always on human-centric perspectives on how we experience, navigate, connect, and play within an increasingly digitalized urban environment. Therefore, this project aims to create a multidisciplinary and translocal space for deep contemplation and imagination on urban cultural transformation from a smart city perspective. And we aim to do so by bringing together artists, researchers, activists, and experts from varying fields across the globe. And although, like almost everything else, while COVID-19 did disrupt many of our initial plans and dreams, we still managed to launch and complete phase 1 of this project, which was a virtual fellowship network. For more details, I encourage you to visit our website and read the many thought-provoking insights of our phase 1 fellows. We also recently released 2 videos featuring our Singaporean contributors, which I also urge you to watch as they feature 2 brilliant individuals, Vera and Kelvin, and their projects and perspectives on the importance of sustainability when thinking about the future city that we would like to live in. So with phase 1 completed, we started phase 2 in August 2001, which aims to then further broaden the conversation through 4 public programming strands. An important goal of phase 2 is to enable and inspire others to join in this conversation of what urban cultural transformation means, especially from the perspective of the future smart city. And we also hope that many others will join in this conversation because it is in the unarticulated and unforeseen gaps that new possibilities begin. That's why I hope that many of you here, if not all of you here, will join us in our phase 2 journey and share our insights about culture and the smart city. One key programming strand of phase 2 is actually this provocation series, which will consist of live virtual dialogues and events exploring what could and what should be the role of urban cultural transformation in the future smart city. We hope that this series will offer fresh perspectives on how culture and cities are evolving before our eyes. The first dialogue took place last month on the 11th of November, which featured urban researcher Chaewon from India in conversation with Professor Jane Jacobs. Do check out our YouTube playlist for the recording, and I believe one of my teammates will share the YouTube playlist link as well. And tonight, we embark on our second dialogue, and I'm pleased to share that we are joined by 2 wonderful urban researchers who will converse with each other to unpack what this term, smart city really and urban, even means. This conversation will be helmed by urban researchers Chaewon and Joshua Cameroff, both of whom are actually colleagues with each other and are currently also based in Singapore. So you might see that they are actually sharing the same screen or same window. Now, and together, they will demystify the term smart city by exploring questions such as who is smart in the smart city, Why is there this goal to even be a smart city? What are the challenges of being a smart city? Is it about data acquisition or data literacy, or even about the power dynamics in planning? And more importantly, can we actually try to redefine the term smart city and to think about what else is missing when we think about the smart city? And before I hand over the virtual floor to them, I would also like to strongly encourage everyone, whether you're on Zoom or Facebook, to be part of this conversation and participate by sharing your thoughts and questions to us in the chat. And with that, I hand over the virtual floor to Joshua first. Thank you, Joshua.
Okay. Actually, I think I'll hand over the virtual floor to Chaewon first, who's going to open by sharing some slides, kind of introduce the topic and to share some images and give us something to chat about. So I'll pass it to you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And also thank you for having me at this Smart City Provocation series with Prof. Joshua Comaroff. My name is Chaewon An, and I prepared some slides to kickstart today's conversation, but before we go into those, I wanted to also talk a little bit more about how my work has been somewhat related to the idea of the smart city. So I work with data collection methods using sensors or kind of purposefully using big data in order to understand how people are using the city and how that could translate into the development of the city. And the reason why I am actually starting this conversation with this question of what's smart in a smart city is really to understand where, in a way, also my work could fit into the idea of a smart city. So with these slides, I try to create a typology of smart cities, see how the idea of a smart city has changed over time, so that we can start to talk about what it means when we talk about a smart city. So the term smart city has been actually used so much in the past 20 years. However, the definition seems to be slightly different depending on who is talking about it. So sometimes it's confusing whether it's a product, whether it's a way of thinking, whether it's a system or a specific set of technology you have to have for it to count as a smart city. And sometimes you also wonder whether it's just another funding mechanism to develop new districts or cities. So, but on the other hand, there have been also many scholars who've been excited about the potential of smart technologies to empower communities and mobilize change in the way we are building our cities. So that really begs the question of, are these ideas also part of what we call the smart city? And if not, what changes are there to be made in order to include them in the smart city? So with this conversation, I hope that we contribute to dissect getting closer to the meaning of what the smart city means. I'm also relatively new to Singapore, so I'm also very curious to learn maybe from Prof. Cameroff, but also from the audience, what it means to build a smart city in Singapore, and further learn more about how we can start to redefine it. I wanted to start this presentation actually with this diagram, which is drawn by the Sensible City Lab, where I used to work at MIT. It really describes how our everyday life is already part of this technological environment. This diagram really shows that with the use of the smart devices that we use in our everyday life, we are already contributing to this digital blanket that is hovering over our cities. And by exchanging signals with our devices, we already create information and we interact with these information systems in a daily basis. So in a way, our life is already very much embedded in this technological environment. And that's perhaps why the idea of the smart city is something that is continuously coming back to us. And if we go back into the history of planning, actually the development of technology and planning has a very intricate relationship. When there is a new technological advancement, it normally has been combined with existing planning ideologies to create a paradigm shift in planning. And different technological ideas emerged depending on how the technology and the planning ideology is combined. So for instance, the very same idea of using ubiquitous smart devices, smartphones, and the GPS devices would give some people the idea that we should create large models and use all the data that is collected through that and use these models to explain and predict what life in cities is and further use them to plan how cities should be. However, other people would be excited about the fact that we can finally do more collaborative planning using these tools because we can finally collect data from communities directly rather than having to resort to some more complicated indirect measures. So before I jump into the smart city, I wanted to maybe go back a little bit in time and think of how the idea of simulations and models have entered planning in the 1960s. The ideas about using these models are kind of called the cybernetic vision of cities. So in the 60s, cities, especially in the US, but also in some cases in Latin America, many cities saw the potential of seeing the city as a communication system that has an input and output. And they thought that cities can be modeled and that you could plug in multiple scenarios. The scenarios could be upgraded in time. And they thought that these would ultimately solve the problems that we still suffer from, which could be urban decay, poverty, healthcare, education, crime, disaster. So in the US, one of those examples is how the US cities actually started to partner with the RAND Corporation, which was a military think tank, to use technologies that were developed during the Cold War for simulations to advise how urban renewal in neighborhoods in LA, New York City, and Philadelphia should play out. So this is kind of a diagram that really shows how they used models and simulations. They would be used essentially by the city government, even though the models would be created and developed from elsewhere. And the idea was to really find areas that need intervention and then resolve them through all the planning measures that the city government had at the time. So the city had the entire power to handle these decisions, but they were also very actively embracing these simulations that were created by these former military entities. So one of those solutions would look like something like this. They would find a place that needs to be renewed and treated by replacing it with new development. And this type of mentality really brought a lot of controversies and a lot of backlash from the communities, actually. So when we look back at this time in the planning history, we think those were all the failed experiments using these simulations. And there is a great book from Jennifer Light that really writes about what the reasons were behind this failure. And she argues that there was this vision of an efficient city management and the treatment of urban deterioration using these models and these systemic thinking. But these simulations always needed input variables that would be translated into something quantitative. And of course, the model would produce wrong outputs if the important information goes missing or if important aspects of city life is not captured or cannot be quantified. So when those things appeared, apparently they just simply neglected these in the model, and that's why the models in itself were not as efficient as they were planned to be. And these backlash also really speak to the idea that there's a lot that is not captured in these quantified versions of the city and these simulations. However, moving forward to the 2000s, we start to see the first versions of the smart city. And I think when we talk about the smart city, these are the emblematic projects that we think about. One is Masdar and one is Songdo. And these are essentially new cities that were built from scratch using smart infrastructure in the back end. And the goal was to really use the ubiquitous computing techniques in the infrastructure to optimize the city operations and also achieve sustainable energy usage. In this process, transnational enterprises such as Cisco, IBM, Siemens would partner with the city government and urban planning firms to realize this vision. And Masdar was built through a partnership between Siemens, Foster, and partners. And the goal was to achieve a net zero city in the middle of a desert. It's a very ambitious goal. And as far as I know, they haven't been able to achieve it, but have been making some progress to nearly going closer to that goal. Songdo is another project between Cisco, KT is a Korean telecom company, and then the city of Incheon. And here their goal is not so much in creating a net zero city, but it is more in combining those smart infrastructure with an international business zone so that the smart city could attract international corporations to start their business in Songdo and kind of move into Seoul through that city. And they are very famous for their automated trash collection system, their centralized traffic control, and their crime prevention mechanisms. But both cities have not achieved their stated policy goals and face a lot of criticism because the data would be concentrated into these systems that were provided by private firms that contributed in building this infrastructure. So as a diagram, the idea is essentially that the city partners with a private company and a planning firm that would, on one hand, build the physical smart city, but also build the smart system and infrastructure. And what the city does is, by partnering with these firms, they also provide the legal ground for all of this to happen. But the idea is really to do it in a place, in an empty land, to start it, to kind of wire the city from scratch with smart infrastructure. The biggest criticism of this was that this kind of idea that there would be one company that takes charge of the entire smart infrastructure is that it delivers sterile solutions, and it has been harshly criticized by people like Adam Greenfield. And the critics really argued that technology shouldn't be used to deliver these optimized and centralized, streamlined solutions, but that there are other ways to use technology rather than how it has been used in a smart city. So what they have been arguing is that there must be avenues through which citizens can actually more fundamentally challenge the ways in which cities are made and operated. And one of those concepts is called the open source urbanism proposed by Saskia Sassen, which argues that we need to create these gaps in the system so that citizens who can use the information and technology can actually use these gaps to participate in city making and basically make city making similar to open source software development. This is a very utopian idea, but it's just another imagination against of how the smart city has unfolded. Nevertheless, the criticism didn't really stop creating newer versions of smart cities. One of the perhaps most recent and most controversial case was the smart city in Toronto, planned by the Sidewalk Lab of Google. And one of their important value was to include citizen input in the design stage, not only to comment on and to co-design the physical aspects of the master plan, but to also establish a responsible data use guideline to resolve this persistent criticism about privacy and surveillance in their version of the smart city. But But in 2018, the privacy expert, Dr. Kavakian, resigned, and she went on to expose that the project is indeed building a surveillance society. She joins the opposite side of this whole controversy, and in 2020, after suffering from COVID, Google announced that they will withdraw the plans from this controversial project. So one thing that is really different in this case is that there is this added component of citizen participation, either whether it is something kind of built into the process through workshops, or whether it is really the citizens of Toronto mobilizing and going on protests against the smart city, yet the voice of the citizens were very much vocal in this case, which is quite interesting. And I think that really draws a distinction between this one and the former models. The Sidewalk Lab really tried to create space for citizen participation by running a lot of workshops. Also, they ran a platform called Collab. And what they did was to invite community and have them comment on the existing master plan, but also help them. They did also some kind of Goethe-Institut style observation workshops where people would go to certain places and observe what social interactions happen there, and perhaps use that data in their design thinking of the site of the Toronto Quayside development. But there were a lot of criticism around those workshops as well, that it is more of an engagement theater, because what citizens could actually comment on was restricted to something very, very partial, given the entire scope of the project. So I think those really triggered a lot of protests outside of these engagement methods that were run by Sidewalk Lab, that were essentially challenging and protesting against the smart city development altogether. And this tendency of trying to create the citizen-centric design or co-design actually can be observed in many contemporary smart city ideas, but many urban researchers have been actually criticizing how that does not really deliver solid outcomes, but is rather an empty signifier, even a civic paternalism. So there is a lot of controversy still there when it comes to kind of opening a large chunk of land and trying to build something. They are using smart technologies as a backend, and as well including citizen input in the process, because essentially the city government and the tech companies and the planning firms are those that are heavily making the decisions in all of these processes. So maybe another approach, which still, in my opinion, falls within the smart city idea, is the idea of smart governance, or the smart enough city. And this really signifies a shift in the way we think about technology, by not putting technology first, but having kind of the goals from the city in the first place, and then using technology purposefully in order to achieve these goals. So I'm drawing all the examples from Boston because I lived there, but these are the work that the city of Boston has embarked as part of their kind of digitization and smart approaches. And here they're not really aiming to open up an area for development that would be totally laden with sensors and be a smart district. It's more about digitizing some of these government services so that citizens can reach the government more easily using smart technologies. But of course, they also have one project looks really into transforming a street segment into a test bed for different sensors, so that they can actually use the sensors and understand how people are using the city. So here, the model is really kind of to enact the smart city in a more decentralized way. The way people would interact with these smart services or smart infrastructure wouldn't be a unified experience. It's more of a happening in many different places in the already existing physical city. And also what's interesting here is that not only private tech companies would participate in the development for these solutions, but also a lot of research groups that are interested in developing technology would also partner with the city government to create these solutions. So it's a very decentralized way of providing smart solutions, and it's a very ad hoc way to implement it. So the overall goal is to work towards improving the just and democratic use of technology, but at the same time refusing to think that there will be a single solution, a single actor that brings all the solutions to the table, or even a single model that can simulate everything. So they are, rather than looking at optimizing systems, they're looking at recognizing that there is a lot of complexity in the way cities work, in the way people interact with cities, in the way institutions work in cities, and try to just solve one problem at a time rather than going back to the more classical ideas of the smart city. And with all that, I wanted to, of course, come back to Singapore and think of how planning in Singapore is engaging with this. And I'm completely new to Singapore, so I'm really here to learn more. But from what I have learned in the past few months is that Singapore has the Smart Nation initiative that is looking into many ways to include smart technology in the way cities are built, but also the nation is built. And when we look into the kind of overview of what is happening in this initiative, a lot of it is about transforming government services into digital platforms, such as the National Digital Identity, cybersecurity projects, from smart parking to better management of medical services. But of course, there is also the very familiar scene of the smart city where an entire district is newly developed with smart infrastructure. And the Punggol Digital District is perhaps one of those which is planned to be finished in 2024. And it not only utilizes smart infrastructure, but also invites research institutes and tech companies to join the innovation economy that will be created there. The most interesting part of that, from what I have seen from the official documents, has been the fact that they are offering this district as a test bed for new innovative products when they want to test their technology. And I think that has been always part of a smart city, but never this explicit and advertised. So I think that's very interesting. So combining these, in a way, I feel like Singapore is the smart city that mixes all these different models. On one hand, we have this kind of approach that more topic-based technology solutions are created to help government agencies to do their job better. But on the other hand, there is also this kind of lingering smart city component where an entire district is redesigned to allow for more experimentation with new smart infrastructure. And my question here really is how these ideas of citizen participation really fits into this, where the room is in the existing smart city, and whether we can change it if there is none. So coming from a background where I am interested in kind of learning how to do projects that uses smart technology, but to empower the communities through the work, I'm just curious of how all these ideas could actually be also part of the smart city that Singapore is building. So I think I will end my presentation here. Should I stop sharing?
Maybe, then
Yeah.
we can chat and answer questions as they come up.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. This was great. I think you're speaking to a lot of the really central questions that I understand to be kind of the sort of provocations that we're trying to kind of move toward in this series. I think getting at a lot of the sort of major questions. I know, I'm sure questions will pop up in the chat and we'll take those when they pop up. But
sure.
in the meantime, I have lots of questions,
Yeah,
because this is fascinating. And one of the questions is something that, and full disclosure, this is something Chaewon and I kind of chatted about with students and with each other before, is this question of methods. And so much of the discussion of smart cities seems to have, this, data is always very data centric, right? Data is always in the middle of it. And I'm just curious, because I know in your own research on industrial districts, looking in Korea, you've used many different kinds of methodologies, different kinds of data, different ways of achieving data, different ways of visualizing data. And then there's this very interesting question of, how do we bring these things together? Like, what do we learn from different kinds of data? So just one thing that I think would be really interesting to hear from you about is this question of, how do you see different kinds of data, different methods of data, and how do you think they come together and kind of telling us what we need to know to be smart, right? Like the kind of what we'd like to know as a smart city about issues, about methods of addressing them, about feedback to things that we try, whether they're working well or whether they need to be further kind of adjusted and tweaked.
Right.
How do you see data in its various kind of forms and
iterations? I mean, thank you for this question. I think about it a lot because I'm trained with kind of a background of using GIS and data-driven analysis to understand cities. But, and I think my dissertation actually helped me to see that there's a lot in the world that's not captured in data, that is not cleaned up in a neat way for researchers to just get and run with. And so I did a project in the middle of Seoul. I was going in expecting that I would have so much data that I could look at and work with. The reality was that still, even in a place like Seoul, a lot of the ways in which, and I was studying industrial, the behavior of firms within an industrial cluster, and a lot of that was really not documented, or the company owners really didn't want to share that information because it was their business secret.
Right.
So it ended up being a lot of the mixing between what the official data is telling me and the larger trends in terms of how industries are doing, but then also really going into the field and collecting surveys myself. So it was somewhat a mix between all these, and then also in the process talking to these people and accidentally doing interviews, which is really not the way I have been trained to do my research. So that really gave me this kind of understanding that no matter how much data we will create in our everyday life using the devices, there will always be this part that is the activities or the people that are not covered. And when we don't see it in data, in these data sets, we kind of think that they don't exist, but in reality, they really, really exist. And so this dissertation really became kind of a turning point for myself to think about what are the other ways to collect data in a smart way if they don't exist. If the smart way doesn't work, what are the more traditional ways to talk to them? Because sometimes I could be spending months devising a sensor, but then in reality, just going to the field, talking to people would actually give me so much more richer information about how they do their work and what are the mechanisms that I was trying to capture through the sensors. So there's this certain kind of aspect that is never really covered with data. And the way I see it is that I think data is still useful because it helps you to say that these individual instances are not individual experiences. They are a part of a larger system, maybe a structural issue. However, I prefer to contextualize that data-driven approach by also combining more qualitative methods, because there's always more than what we can capture from data. There's always, and these qualitative insights really provide you with the kind of reason around that. You can see patterns, you can see trends, but understanding the motivation behind it is another level. And I feel like that is something that is largely missing when we only look at quantitative information. And one thing that's really interesting with planning is that it's so difficult to incorporate these qualitative information when you are trying to make a decision on a master plan. So actually my question to you is, I know you are deeply engaged with many of these kind of conversations of decision-making processes, and I'm just curious how, I guess it's always my curiosity to learn how data-driven approaches versus other types of information gets really synthesized into these decision-making processes. And I feel like that doesn't even get to the smart city conversation.
Yeah, it's sort of one step back from it in a way, because it's like preparing for the smart city question of like, how do we use this data? What do we use it for? And it's more back at, how do we know what we're looking at when we look for data collection and for human behavior and all of its weirdness and complexity, right? And then how are decisions, made based on that?
Yeah.
I think, just speaking from, so I've been in Singapore for nearly 20 years. So most of the projects I've been working on are here. And I think what's really interesting is we're starting to see, I think, an implicit realization that is getting very much to what you were just saying, which is this idea that multiple methodologies need to be used if we really need to understand, why things are happening, and then take kind of intelligent action or, smart action based on that. That big data is essential. It gives us incredible patterns and correlations that we can then kind of look at and start to say, okay, something is going on here, something significant. You can understand, for example, say, behavioral choices. And then, of course, they always beg that question of why? Why are people doing this and not that, right? And the data, even if we multiply it, sometimes gives us more and more resolution, but doesn't get closer to why. So we've seen, so there was this wonderful project I was working on with the URA's A2FN project. We're looking at kind of elderly people in public housing, and why, for example, why do people not sit in shared tables or shared furniture, right? And we had incredible information about, why, when they didn't, how many people would sit, it was never quite the number, but we didn't know why. And then, you ask them, they say, oh, well, if somebody's sitting there already, then I feel like if I sit next to them, they're forced to talk to me, and I feel very embarrassed. And if two people are there, I feel like I'm kind of barging in on their conversation. And so when you start doing that interview layer, then it starts to fill in, and then you start to ask questions of like, okay, are existing, say, furniture designs in public housing optimal? Should we be just having pairs or singles, rather than kind of clusters around tables of four or whatever, So it becomes that that kind of very layered thing. And I think increasingly in many of the research projects I'm seeing, there are more and more sophisticated ways of thinking about how multiple methodologies kind of complement each other, and that's where I think maybe part of the smart city is that learning process of understanding like how should we be collecting data, like what are the methods, and how should we do it? Should be how much qualitative, how much quantitative? Do we do the quantitative first and then kind of find the questions we want to answer through qualitative data? And I think that's I think that's part of the kind of process, kind of that cyclical improvement. Yeah.
I just have a very quick comment about the quantitative, like the inclusion of quantitative information into these decision-making processes. I feel like there's a lot of ways in which things have been done in the past that kind of lingers as we are moving into a new mode of planning, even though those habits might be, I'm just assuming, but like those habits would be stuff that we need to kind of reconsider when we are trying to shift gears. And I feel like there's also this kind of very traditional divide in the training of how people actually, become familiar with quantitative versus qualitative methods. I can imagine a kind of computer scientist when they're told to include quantitative information, go to natural language processing and just go into like, how do we use coding to understand what people are saying, rather than really kind of going into the experiential aspect of what those qualitative methods would mean. So for me personally, I feel like I feel like I'm a special. I had to learn all these different things to do my project, but I feel like in many ways it's really moving more and more into a world where we need to learn how to work with other people who have different skill sets and can actually be in conversation about what this process should be like, or what we are looking for when we are engaging in this type of, even if it's data heavy or even if it's very qualitative.
And maybe being able to kind of do both, right? In a sense. I mean, because, just a little background, both Chaewon and I are trained initially in architecture. We both been in architecture school. And, one of the things you learn in architecture school is about how to anticipate what the engineer is going to be thinking about, right? Civil structural versus HVAC, or what we need to do when we think about city government and building codes, for example. And what seems to be interesting now is the rise of a generation of people, and I think you're very much characteristic of this, of people that don't need to sit on one side of a team versus another, like that there's a quantitative kind of half and there's a qualitative half, but there are people that are equally conversant in both sides. I mean, my sense is that the smart city in a way needs a kind of a fluency where some of those kind of sticky old prejudices that I think you're absolutely right, and they're very much still around, can start to kind of subside because people are kind of equally comfortable in those spheres, Yeah. I thought one thing that was super interesting. Sorry, we have a bunch of questions. We'll go to these in one. So I just asked one more question, and then we'll go to the chat. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was the RAND Corporation, and that made me think of something really specific. I remember taking a tour of the old RAND Corporation headquarters. It's like this virtual tour with photographs. I never actually got inside the building. I don't know if you're allowed to go in the building. But one of the things that was really interesting about the architectural design is they had these corridors that were conflicting in such a way, and the idea was that people would bump into each other, like almost physically bump into each other. And in the areas where the corridors overlapped, at those intersections, there were couches and tables. And the idea is that because they had these interdisciplinary teams, that people would kind of bump into each other and they'd start these conversations. And because they were coming from different expertise, this was kind of the beginning of a kind of say a collider or an aggregator model, right? Where people would strike up kind of interesting interdisciplinary projects. And it made me think, in the context of kind of your comments just now about the question of like accident in the smart city, like creative accident in the smart city, right? It seems like so much of the model has to do with like efficiency and perfection and making sure that things run smoothly.
Right.
Do you see any room in any of these models for the kind of creative chaos, that kind of shakeup that maybe we need to make the city something where, unexpected things happen? Or are we just over determining everything?
Maybe, I don't know. It's a very interesting question, but it's also kind of, so when you're trying to model pretty much everything, I think you fall into that trap that the model is only going to be as smart as the person who is modeling them.
Right.
So the unexpected aspects are something that would be precluded already in the process. But if we imagine multiple models being overlapped rather than one model controlling the entire city, maybe there would be glitches, and maybe those glitches or errors would be actually the exciting parts of it.
Yeah.
But they could also be very catastrophic. So I don't know if I
you have
can
to make the right kind of errors, right?
So how do you then ensure that you don't have the wrong kind of errors? I guess that kind of moves beyond my area of expertise. Maybe people who are more into physics would know better.
Or some kind of like chaos theory of collisions and creative ones. Okay, well, let's ask. Somebody said, hi, thank you for the sharing, really enjoyed it. Singapore Smart Nation initiatives feel very infrastructure focused. What do you think is missing from Singapore Smart Nation initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could really talk about it, but I have been here only 3 months now. So I am very new, and I'm still learning about the Singapore's model of the smart city. But I definitely struggled finding participatory methods to include citizens' opinions into the process. Even with the Google Sidewalk Lab, their branding was very much about how we are not the old smart city model. And I know that Singapore has these participatory workshops when they are coming up with the new master plan and all, but I don't know, and I would be really happy to learn more about it if there are actually these kind of projects or these engagement efforts where this is actually happening. But to answer the question, I would say that those aspects are something that I would love to see more upfront in their way of promoting the smart city.
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, again, I'm not the expert on this, but I think just in my own kind of experience looking at some of these initiatives here, definitely ones that are infrastructure led or technology led do have a higher level of visibility, right? They're very often, that's where we get these kind of fascinating renderings. That's where we see kind of green city models. That's where we see things like, automated cars and so on. There are, I think, a lot of kind of interesting things that could fit under a smart city envelope. One of the people that I think or one of the groups I think are doing this in a really interesting interdisciplinary way is the Ministry of Health's Transformation Office, MOHT. And they're doing really interesting things, for example, that brings together, say, behavioral psychology with design of various disciplines with technologists as well. So there is some really kind of interesting stuff. I think it's starting to become more decentralized. I think there may be a little bit of a publicity gap, between the projects that we see in the newspaper and the ones that are going on. But there are some really interesting ones going on. I could say thank you for your sharing the background to the term smart city, which has lasted for decades. What do you think is the appeal of the continual use of this term smart city, especially for more ground up communities?
So with ground up, I'm assuming it's going to be more the bottom up approaches.
I think what I understand is more kind of say things that initiate more at the grassroots level rather than being say, as opposed to just say a centralized authority, say consulting a public, more things that originate with the public and then become part of their infrastructure.
I feel like the way they use the word smart city is definitely a very different thing. I think when it is used in a more bottom up manner, also they tend to have many different names. Rather than smart city, many people would kind of brand it as a citizen science project or a crowdsourcing project versus a smart city project, even though they might be using the very same technologies. So I feel like it's almost like a war around language at some point. But I think the fact that we still live in this very technology saturated world really means that this is going to continue and even become a stronger tendency in all perspectives involving planning. So I feel like even though the word seems to be so outdated, it still kind of comes back with a new twist on it because it is just the reality we live in, the smart devices. So I don't know if that answered the question adequately, but I feel like there might be some attempts to deviate from that term in itself. But
do you think that's because there's like a stigma or like a fatigue associated with the term? I feel like if you think about, say, an analog and say the concept of the eco-city, I mean, Masdar was often spoken about as an eco-city. It was a term that, by itself would kind of, everyone would hear the term and kind of start to pay attention. Now it's a little bit the opposite. People hear eco-city, so like now you hear more terms like, say a sustainable city, sustainable city making or environmentally friendly city, kind of more generic, less branded language comes back.
Oh yeah, definitely. I guess something that we see a lot these days is also the word civic tech. It essentially is a similar idea. You would use technology, but I guess smart city, because it's associated so strongly with the specific policy goal to optimize and to also bring this private company into the game to build the city. I think there are cautious kind of considerations to move away from that language and invent their own terms. But then again, I feel like moving too far away from that is also kind of detaching yourself too much from what you're reacting to. So there's an intricate kind of distance managed there somewhat.
So in your opinion, it should be something where we allow the language to kind of incrementally develop as a concept and the systems mature, rather than kind of either love it or then have an adverse reaction to it, move in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I feel like it's time that something in between is born, rather than this like, the absolute enthusiast of smart cities and then this like absolute opponent of the smart cities. I feel like it's about time that something that mitigates that tension somehow in a smart way.
Well, do you think in a way though, it's, because I think your mention of Civic Tech is really interesting. So when we think of the civic, we think of participation, we think of people, we think of a public. Whereas when you think of the smart city, you're thinking of a product, a space, there's a kind of a techno-utopian kind of object-like vibe to it. I mean, it's like that Mazda microchip, right? Whereas I wonder if like what starts to happen is that we start to move down the rungs of specificity, right? Where we stop talking about the branded idea, but we start to kind of get familiar with that and then start to talk about the components. Like that question that, we kind of began with, like, who is smart in the smart city? Maybe we're starting to talk specifically about systems or specifically about algorithmic processes or specifically about data collection or people, and where it comes from. That maybe that's the maturity, is not to kind of get too kind of in love with or repulsed by the term, but then kind of the term has its life and then it, kind of fades away because we're talking already about subsets of issues that come under that. I don't know.
Right.
Maybe we have time, I think, for one last.
Yes.
So it says, hi, Professor An, thank you for sharing more about the different versions of smart cities. In regard to your first discussion question on who is smart in the smart city, would an alternative be the corporations themselves? Are they the ones who are leveraging on the data provided from the founding of these smart cities to implicitly test out their technology on the citizens with, with government support? So in a way, do you think the, is the corporation, have they become the protagonists? I think that's kind of what the question is getting toward. Are they the ones who are the smart folks?
I think there's definitely this kind of attempt to dominate what is smart by those corporations, because they are the ones who are, but then again, these algorithms or these systems are not an open knowledge. It's their proprietary software, their proprietary information. So it's very interesting how it is branded as smart, but then also very opaque or vague as to what it exactly is.
It's a bit of a black box, no? I mean, for most of us, I think, yeah.
Exactly. So I feel like that is one way, that version of the smart city, in that version, I think that was the ones that were deemed to be smart. Also, perhaps the city governments that are so woke to adapt that technology, embrace that new vision and really run with the idea, would have also been kind of the ones that are supposed to be the smart ones in this. However, I think that is still kind of the technology being combined with this old mentality of planning, where these elite planners would top down make decisions and then define what the city has to be like, giving the solution. Whereas with more recent approaches, I feel like there needs to be this divide from that planning mentality entirely as well. Like you cannot ask, a kind of bottom-up civic tech project to provide solutions, because the idea is, because then you are kind of associating back this technology with that old way of planning. So it's more about embracing the multitude of other smart people that have their own lived experiences and therefore are smart in their own ways, but maybe not necessarily smart in a kind of algorithmically quantifiable way. And then really the goal has to shift from providing solutions to kind of seeing the variety, or I don't know, seeing the multitude of possibilities. And that, I don't know. I think about that all the time, because like if you try to look at these and think, what can we decide based on this information? It is really using that technology based on that old planning model. So that division is something that maybe the smart city has to move forward to.
It's kind of like this idea again that it was mentioned in the chat, this concept of the in-between, just kind of pick up what you said before. I mean, I think there was a beautiful example of this in Singapore that we saw in our own, our own office does a lot of work in inclusive design, caring for people with dementia. And one of the things we discovered, which brings me back to something you said right at the beginning, was that carers, people who are caring either for a family member or non-family member with dementia, their lives are very difficult, right? They're kind of 24 hours a day on call. They always have much more to do than they possibly have the time or the capacity or the money to do. But they were using WhatsApp and all kinds of amazing, like just the simple fact of the WhatsApp chat enabled them to, for somebody to pick up the slack on somebody else who was overwhelmed. Right? There was this very flexible network that was just using the simple technology to kind of its maximum degree, to its most intelligent degree, just by kind of being in contact with each other. And what I think was interesting about that was it kind of came back to something that you you kind of suggested toward the beginning, which was in a way like we can't back away from the smart city. Like the smart city is here. It's here. It's already here with devices like this, right? I mean, and people are using it. So one of the things that seems to be really interesting in that question of the in-between is like linking back between things that are happening organically using smart devices and then planning methodologies that, you know, are dealing with these kind of larger, more overarching infrastructural questions, and also wondering how to kind of bring these different kind of sites of activity together into one thing. And it seems like that's like one of those kind of really interesting questions of how to link those things without trying to over-organize them, trying to kind of calcify them into like a planning process where they become kind of frozen.
Right.
Yeah. I think we are at 8:58. I don't know if Chaewon had some closing comments she'd like to make. Maybe we can pass over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes. Okay. So thank you both, Chaewon and Joshua, for this conversation. I really, from the bottom of my heart, I would really like to thank both of you for agreeing to our invitation and also for enriching this project, because I do think that tonight's dialogue between the both of you was an important part of this conversation, as it did clarify the origins but also evolutions of the term smart city, while also challenging the possible limitations of this term. And for me personally, I particularly enjoyed the discussion between both of you, as it animatedly kind of teases out the kind of limitations, but also the possibilities of the smart city discourse. And I also hope that each of you here who have graciously joined us today in today's dialogue have also found this discussion insightful. Just before we officially close this session, I would just like to reshare that tonight's dialogue is just one of many more upcoming programs that is part of the Culture and the Smart City project. The Culture and the Smart City Provocation series will continue with more virtual dialogues and events, including workshops in the upcoming year. We will also have an upcoming hybrid exhibition in March 2022, which we hope to actually see many of you at. We invite you to keep updated on our programs either by following us on our social media channels or checking our website regularly. Importantly, on behalf of my team, Victoria, Carissa, Charlotte, Jasmine, Nadia, and myself, we would like to thank Valerie and Christine from the Goethe-Institut Singapore for their generous support. We would also like to thank each of you here for being such a warm and engaged audience, and we hope to see you soon in other programs of this project. Finally, to help us do better, we invite you to provide us feedback through the link, especially in terms of what else you would like to hear or learn more from this project. And with that, we wish you well, stay safe, and have a good day or good night. Thank you.